The cruelest goodbyes are the ones that happen before the vows are ever spoken. I never imagined those words would become the story of my own life. One minute I was standing beneath the white roses that framed the altar of St. Matthew's Church, smoothing the front of my wedding dress while trying to calm the butterflies in my stomach. The next minute, I was watching hundreds of familiar faces slowly realize that the groom was never coming. At first, everyone smiled politely. Someone joked that traffic in downtown Chicago had always been terrible on Saturdays. My maid of honor squeezed my hand and whispered that everything would be fine. I believed her because I had spent the last 3 years believing the man I loved would never embarrass me. Then 15 minutes became 30. 30 became an hour. My phone remained silent except for messages asking the same question I could not answer. Where was he? I called again and again until every call went directly to voicemail. Finally, my wedding planner approached with sympathetic eyes that said everything her lips refused to say. The guests began leaving one family at a time. Some hugged me. Some avoided looking at me altogether. Others whispered behind careful smiles, believing I could not hear them. I heard every word. Poor Claire. What a tragedy. Did he change his mind? Did she not know? Every sentence felt heavier than the bouquet slipping from my trembling fingers onto the polished church floor. My father quietly removed his jacket and placed it around my shoulders even though the afternoon was warm. My mother cried without making a sound. I wanted to cry too, but something inside me had already gone numb. When the church finally emptied, I stood alone beneath the flowers that had been chosen for a celebration that no longer existed. I slipped the engagement ring from my finger and held it tightly inside my palm before walking toward the front doors. The late afternoon sunlight felt strangely cold against my face. I barely noticed the photographers waiting across the street until camera flashes reflected against the windows. By tomorrow, my humiliation would belong to the entire city. I lowered my head and started walking, determined to disappear before anyone asked another question I could not answer. Then every conversation around me stopped at once. A long line of identical black luxury vehicles rolled quietly toward the church entrance before coming to a perfect stop. Uniformed drivers stepped out in complete silence. One rear door opened. A tall man wearing a perfectly tailored black suit emerged with the calm confidence of someone who had never rushed a single moment in his life. His piercing blue eyes met mine before he spoke a single word. I recognized him immediately. Everyone in Chicago knew Damian Romano, even if few people admitted saying his name out loud. He walked toward me without hesitation while dozens of stunned strangers watched from the sidewalk. When he finally stopped only a few feet away, his voice remained steady, low, and impossible to ignore. "If the man who promised you forever walked away," he said, "then come with me, Claire. I never break my promises." I stared at Damian Romano as though the entire city had suddenly stopped making sense. Every instinct told me to walk away, yet my feet refused to move. Around us, reporters lowered their cameras just enough to exchange confused looks. Even they did not know what they were witnessing. Damian did not reach for my hand. He did not pressure me. He simply waited with the patience of a man completely comfortable with silence. "I am not asking you to trust me," he said softly. "I am asking you not to face today alone." I swallowed the lump in my throat and looked down at the engagement ring still resting in my palm. Less than 2 hours earlier, that tiny diamond had represented my entire future. Now it felt like nothing more than a cold piece of metal. My parents stood a few yards away, uncertain whether they should intervene. My mother searched my face for answers I did not have. My father looked at Damian with cautious disbelief, but there was something unexpected in his expression. Relief. Because despite everything people whispered about the Romano name, the stranger standing before me was the only person who had shown me genuine kindness all afternoon. I finally managed to speak. "Why are you doing this?" Damian's blue eyes never left mine. "Because humiliation should never have the final word." The sentence settled somewhere deep inside me. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated again. Another message from the man who had abandoned me. It contained only 7 words. "I am sorry. This is for the best." I read it twice before quietly deleting it forever. My hand stopped shaking. I realized I was not crying because there was nothing left to mourn. The future I had imagined no longer existed. I took one slow breath, slipped the ring into my small purse, and nodded almost without realizing it. Damian gave the slightest smile, one that never reached beyond quiet respect. He stepped aside instead of leading me, allowing me to choose the direction myself. That small gesture mattered more than he could have known. As I approached the waiting black sedan, one of the drivers politely opened the rear door. The interior was elegant without being excessive, filled with soft leather, warm wood, and the faint scent of cedar. Damien entered only after I had settled into my seat. No one spoke as the vehicle pulled away from the church. Outside the window, Chicago continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened, but I knew my life had crossed an invisible line. After several quiet minutes, Damien looked out at the passing skyline before speaking again. "By sunrise," he said calmly, "everyone will believe you belong to my world." I turned toward him, confused. He met my eyes with complete honesty. "They will be wrong unless you decide otherwise. Until then, no one will tell you who you are ever again." For the first time that impossible day, I felt something stronger than heartbreak. I felt the unfamiliar weight of a choice that finally belonged to me. I expected towering gates, armed guards, and an atmosphere that would make me regret every decision I had made that afternoon. Instead, the Romano estate greeted me with quiet elegance. Long rows of oak trees lined the winding driveway, their leaves glowing beneath the fading orange sky. A wide fountain reflected the last light of the evening, while carefully maintained gardens surrounded a stone mansion that looked more like an old American estate than anything I had imagined. The car stopped beneath a covered entrance where an elderly woman wearing a neatly pressed navy dress welcomed us with a warm smile. "Welcome home, Miss Bennett," she said gently. I almost laughed at the words because nowhere in my mind could this place ever become home. Damien handed his suit jacket to another employee before turning toward everyone gathered inside the entrance hall. His expression remained calm, but the room instantly fell silent. "Claire is under my protection," he said. "She is to be treated with the same respect you would offer any member of my family." No one questioned him. No one even hesitated. Every person simply nodded before quietly returning to their responsibilities. I followed him across polished marble floors while trying to understand what had just happened. Finally, I asked the question that had been building inside me since we left the church. Why would they listen so quickly? Damien glanced toward me without slowing his pace. "Because respect begins with consistency. They already know what I expect." He stopped outside a beautiful guest suite overlooking the gardens. The room was peaceful, filled with soft natural colors, fresh flowers, and books resting beside a comfortable reading chair. Nothing about it felt extravagant for the sake of showing wealth. Everything felt intentionally welcoming. "This room is yours for as long as you need it," he said. "There are only 3 rules." I crossed my arms, preparing myself for impossible demands. Instead, he spoke quietly. "No one enters without your permission. No one asks about today unless you choose to talk about it. And no one makes you feel like a burden." I stared at him in complete disbelief. "Those are your rules." He nodded once. "Every person deserves a place where they can breathe." Before I could answer, a young housekeeper appeared with a tray holding hot tea and a simple dinner. She smiled naturally instead of nervously. "If there is anything you need, Miss Bennett, please let us know." After she left, Damien stepped toward the doorway. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow the world will invent stories about you. You do not have to believe any of them." He turned to leave before I stopped him with one quiet question. "What story do you believe?" He paused for only a moment before looking back at me with steady blue eyes. "I believe a woman who is abandoned today deserves to decide how the next chapter begins." The door closed softly behind him, and for the first time since my wedding morning, I realized someone had offered me safety without asking for anything in return. I woke before sunrise, convinced for one confused second that the previous day had only been a nightmare. Then I opened my eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling, soft morning light spilling across polished hardwood floors, and the reality returned with quiet certainty. The wedding was over before it had begun. I was living inside Damien Romano's estate. I dressed in the simple clothes someone had thoughtfully placed inside the closet, then followed the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the hallway. The mansion was remarkably peaceful. No shouting, no rushing, just the faint sound of piano music echoing from somewhere downstairs. I found the elderly housekeeper arranging flowers in the dining room. She greeted me with the same gentle smile she had worn the night before. "Good morning, Miss Bennett. Breakfast is ready whenever you are." I thanked her and expected to eat alone, but a familiar voice carried from the open terrace beyond the dining room. Damien stood outside overlooking the gardens, holding a coffee cup while reading several neatly organized documents. He looked less like the feared man described by newspapers and more like someone carrying responsibilities that never seemed to end. He noticed me almost immediately and folded the papers without hiding them. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. I nodded. "Better than I expected." He offered a quiet smile. "That is a good beginning." During breakfast, I expected awkward silence, yet the conversation stayed surprisingly ordinary. He asked whether I preferred tea or coffee, whether I enjoyed reading, and what kind of music I listened to while driving. Not once did he mention the wedding. Not once did he ask about the man who had left me standing at the altar. After breakfast, a black sedan arrived at the front entrance, but instead of leaving immediately, Damien walked toward a small community center located just beyond the estate gardens. Curious, I followed at a respectful distance with permission from the housekeeper. Inside, several neighborhood children gathered around long tables covered with books, puzzles, and art supplies. The moment Damien entered, their faces lit with excitement. They ran toward him without fear, proudly showing drawings, homework assignments, and handmade birthday cards. He listened to every story as though each child were the only person in the room. Later, an elderly woman thanked him quietly for helping pay for her medical treatments. He accepted her gratitude with visible discomfort and gently changed the subject before anyone could praise him further. I watched from across the room, unable to reconcile the compassionate man before me with the cold public image that had filled headlines for years. On the drive back to the estate, I finally asked the question that refused to leave my mind. Why does everyone outside believe you are someone completely different? Damien kept his eyes on the road ahead before answering in his calm, steady voice. Because people rarely stay long enough to see the chapters that come after the first impression. As I looked out the window at the passing streets, I realized I had judged him before learning even a single page of his story. And somehow that realization unsettled me far more than anything I had believed yesterday. I stayed at the Romano estate for 3 more days because I still had nowhere else to go, yet every morning I reminded myself that I was only a guest. I helped the housekeeper arrange fresh flowers, read novels in the library, and wandered through gardens that seemed too peaceful to belong to the man the newspapers loved to fear. Damien never asked me to stay longer, and he never suggested I should leave. He simply treated every new day as though my presence required no explanation. On the 4th afternoon, that fragile peace cracked. My phone rang while I was sitting beside the fountain, watching the water shimmer beneath the warm September sun. I recognized the number immediately. My former fiancé. My thumb hovered over the screen before I answered. His voice sounded strangely confident, almost rehearsed. He told me he wanted to meet. He claimed everything had been a misunderstanding. He insisted people had manipulated him. Then he said the one sentence that made my heart grow completely still. "Come back before you ruin your future by staying with Damien Romano." I ended the call without replying. Less than 10 minutes later, a black luxury sport utility vehicle stopped outside the estate gates. The security team informed Damien that my former fiancé was requesting a conversation. I expected Damien to refuse immediately. Instead, he looked toward me with the same calm expression he always carried. "The decision is yours, Claire," he said. "If you wish to see him, you may. If you do not, no one will pressure you either way." I searched his face for hidden expectations, but found none. He was not choosing for me. He was protecting my right to choose for myself. I walked toward the front garden where my former fiancé waited near the entrance. His expensive suit looked perfect, yet the sincerity I had once believed in was gone. He apologized again, explaining that the wedding had become too overwhelming. He blamed fear, family expectations, financial pressure, and bad timing. Every excuse sounded polished, but none answered the only question that mattered. "Why did you leave without telling me?" He lowered his eyes. Silence answered first. Then he admitted he had believed he could always return if things did not work out. Something inside me finally settled. I realized I was not speaking to the man I had planned to marry. I was speaking to the version of him I had refused to see. I thanked him for the honesty he should have offered weeks earlier. Then I quietly wished him a good life. As I turned away, I noticed Damien standing several yards behind me on the terrace. He had not interrupted. He had not listened closely enough to invade my privacy. He had simply remained nearby in case I needed support. When I reached him, he did not ask what had been said. He only opened the front door and said, "Welcome back." For the first time since my wedding day, those two simple words felt like they belonged exactly where I did. I thought ending one chapter would make the next one easier to understand, but healing turned out to be quieter than I expected. The days at the Romano estate settled into a gentle rhythm that slowly replaced the constant ache I had carried since the wedding. Every morning, I joined the housekeeper for breakfast before wandering through the gardens with a cup of coffee. Damien usually left for meetings shortly after sunrise and returned just before dinner, yet despite the demands on his time, he always asked one simple question when we crossed paths. "How was your day?" There was never an agenda hidden behind those words. He listened because he genuinely wanted the answer. One cool evening we walked through the estate gardens beneath strings of warm lights that had been placed among the old oak trees. The air smelled of fresh cedar after a brief afternoon rain, and the stone pathways still reflected tiny pools of water beneath our feet. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence felt comfortable instead of awkward. Finally, I stopped beside the fountain where we had shared coffee only days before. "You could have told me not to see him," I said quietly. "Most people would have." Damien rested one hand against the smooth stone edge of the fountain before answering. "If I had made the decision for you, it would never have been your freedom. It would only have been my opinion." I looked at him, searching for the confidence that usually filled his calm expression. Instead, I found something much more vulnerable. "Were you afraid I would leave?" I asked. He smiled, but there was sadness behind it. Every meaningful choice carries that risk. His honesty caught me completely off guard. For the first time since meeting him, I realized he never assumed he deserved a place in anyone's life. Everything he offered came without conditions. "Then why help me at all?" I whispered. He looked toward the fountain where the water moved in slow circles beneath the evening lights. "Because someone should have reminded you that being abandoned does not make you unworthy." The words settled deep inside my heart. I felt tears gathering, not from sadness but from relief. I had spent so many days questioning my value that I had forgotten it was never supposed to depend on another person's decision. Damien reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and for one impossible second I wondered whether he was about to hand me something expensive or symbolic. Instead, he pulled out a folded business card. It belonged to a respected architectural design firm in downtown Chicago. "They are looking for an event coordinator," he said. "Your background organizing weddings would translate well." I did not arrange an interview. I only asked whether they were hiring. "The rest is entirely your choice." I accepted the card slowly, realizing once again that he never tried to control my future. He simply opened doors and allowed me to decide whether to walk through them. As we continued toward the mansion beneath the glowing evening sky, I understood something that frightened me almost as much as it comforted me. Somewhere between the church steps and this quiet garden, the safest place I had ever known had become the man walking beside me. The interview at the architectural design firm was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and for the first time in weeks I woke up feeling excited instead of anxious. I thanked the housekeeper for wishing me luck, accepted a cup of coffee from the kitchen, and found Damien reviewing documents in the sunlit library before leaving for his own meetings. "You are going to do well," he said with complete confidence. I laughed softly. "You have not even seen my resume." He closed the folder in front of him and looked at me with that familiar calm expression. "I have seen your character. Everything else can be learned." Those words stayed with me long after I left the room. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours, and when I walked back outside into the crisp Chicago afternoon, I realized I had smiled more during that conversation than I had in months. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, my phone buzzed with a message from the firm. They wanted to offer me the position. I stood completely still, reading the message again just to be certain it was real. I wanted to tell someone immediately. Without thinking, I called Damien. He answered after the first ring. "Claire." I could hear the quiet concern in his voice. "I got the job," I said, unable to hide my excitement. For the first time since I had met him, he laughed openly. It was warm, genuine, and completely unexpected. "I knew you would," he replied. "Come home. We should celebrate." Home. The word no longer sounded strange. Later that evening, the housekeeper prepared a simple dinner on the garden terrace. Candles flickered gently across the table while the last colors of sunset faded behind the trees. Halfway through the meal, One of Damien's trusted employees approached quietly and handed him a sealed envelope that had just arrived by courier. Damien opened it, scanned the contents, and the easy smile disappeared from his face. He folded the paper slowly before slipping it back inside without another word. I had never seen him look unsettled before. "Is everything all right?" I asked. He hesitated for several seconds. "Someone has been asking unusual questions about you." My heart skipped. "About me?" He nodded. "Nothing dangerous. Just unexpected." I frowned, trying to understand why anyone would suddenly care about an ordinary woman whose biggest recent accomplishment was surviving public embarrassment. "Who?" I asked. Damien looked directly into my eyes. "I do not know yet." Before I could respond, the housekeeper accidentally dropped a small serving tray nearby. The sharp sound echoed across the quiet terrace, making me jump. Without thinking, Damien stepped between me and the noise, his attention fixed entirely on making sure I was unharmed before realizing what had actually happened. The movement lasted only a second, yet it revealed something words never could. His first instinct was not to protect himself. It was to protect me. As our eyes met across the candlelight, I understood that whatever uncertainty waited beyond the estate gates, neither of us was facing it alone anymore. The next morning the estate felt unusually quiet, as though everyone had silently agreed not to ask questions that did not yet have answers. I tried focusing on my new job, reviewing schedules and organizing notes for my first week at the architectural firm, but my thoughts kept returning to the expression on Damien's face when he read the letter. It was not fear. It was concern, and somehow that unsettled me even more. Late that afternoon, I found him standing alone in the greenhouse at the far edge of the gardens, carefully watering white orchids that bloomed beneath the glass ceiling. The warm light filtered through the panes, covering everything in soft gold. It was difficult to imagine that the same man who commanded so much respect could spend an hour quietly caring for delicate flowers. He noticed me before I spoke. "I was wondering when you would come looking for answers," he said with a faint smile. I stepped closer, breathing in the scent of fresh soil and jasmine. "You promised no one would hide things from me." He nodded once. "You are right." For a long moment he remained silent, choosing his words with care. "The questions are not about something you did. They are about someone connected to your family many years ago." I frowned in confusion. "My family lived ordinary lives." "That is exactly why it surprised me," he replied. He reached into a nearby cabinet and removed an old wooden box that looked worn by time. Inside rested several yellowed photographs and a faded newspaper clipping. He handed me one photograph showing a much younger version of my father standing beside another man whose face I recognized immediately from portraits hanging throughout the mansion. Damien's father. I stared at the image in disbelief. "They knew each other?" I whispered. Damien nodded slowly. "They served together as volunteer mentors for neighborhood youth almost 30 years ago. They lost contact after my father became ill, but he never forgot your father's kindness." I looked down at the photograph again, noticing the genuine smiles neither man appeared to be forcing. Suddenly, so many small moments made sense. The way Damien had looked at my father outside the church, the quiet respect in his eyes, the decision to help a stranger, without expecting anything in return. "You knew who I was before the wedding, did not you?" I asked softly. "I recognized your last name," he admitted. "When I saw your father standing beside you that afternoon, I remembered everything my father used to say about him. Then I watched someone leave you standing alone, and I could not walk away." Emotion tightened my throat. He had never rescued me because of power or obligation. He had acted because of gratitude carried across an entire generation. I carefully returned the photograph to the box before looking back at him. "Your father must have been an extraordinary man." Damien smiled with quiet sadness. "He taught me that the strongest people are the ones who protect dignity instead of pride." As evening light filled the greenhouse, I realized the invisible thread connecting our lives had been woven long before either of us had ever met, and destiny had simply waited for the moment when both of us were finally ready to see it. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the Romano estate with shades of gold that seemed brighter than I remembered from any other year. My new career had begun, and every evening I returned through the front gates with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with the woman who had once stood alone inside a church. Life no longer felt like something that had happened to me. It finally felt like something I was building with my own hands. Damien never asked where our story was going. He continued treating every day with the same quiet respect that had first convinced me to trust him. One Saturday afternoon, the housekeeper invited us into the gardens, explaining that several neighbors and families from the community center were coming for a small harvest celebration. Children laughed beneath strings of warm lights while music drifted through the crisp air. Elderly couples danced slowly across the lawn, and long wooden tables overflowed with homemade pies, fresh bread, and steaming cider. Watching Damien move naturally among everyone, greeting each guest by name and stopping to listen to every conversation, I realized his greatest strength had never been influence. It had always been presence. As the evening sun settled behind the oak trees, he quietly asked if I would walk with him. We followed the familiar stone path toward the fountain where so many important conversations had begun. Neither of us hurried to fill the silence. The fountain reflected the last light of day while golden leaves floated gently across the water. Damien reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and I smiled before he even spoke. "If that is another business card, I promise I will not complain," I teased. He laughed softly. "Not this time." Instead of a velvet ring box, he held a simple brass key resting in the palm of his hand. It was worn slightly around the edges, as though it had unlocked the same door for many years. He placed it carefully into my hand, without closing my fingers around it. "This is the front door key to my home," he said quietly. "I am not asking because I want to own your future. I am asking because I hope you will choose to share it." My eyes filled with tears before I could answer. Every promise I had once believed in had been wrapped inside expensive words that disappeared when life became difficult. This promise looked different. It looked like trust. It looked like respect. It looked like someone offering me a place instead of possession. I closed my fingers around the key and looked directly into his blue eyes. "Yes," I whispered. "Not because I need somewhere to belong. Because I have already found it." He smiled with the quiet relief of a man who had waited patiently without expecting anything in return. As our friends applauded from across the garden, the housekeeper wiped happy tears from her eyes and captured the moment with an old camera. I slipped my hand into Damien's, and together we walked back toward the lights of the estate that no longer felt borrowed. Sometimes life does not give us the ending we planned. Sometimes it quietly places a better beginning in our path, waiting for the courage to recognize it when it finally arrives.